Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on behalf of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce Working Group, Climate Response, La Vie en Vert. I'm Mary Honohan, I'm your moderator this morning. I'm a partner at PwC, and I am a member of the Council of the France-Ireland Chamber of Commerce, the executive, and I chair Climate Response, La Vie en Vert. We've called our webinar Reflections on COP26. There's no doubt that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our generation. The COP26 in Glasgow was billed by many as the last best chance for averting disastrous climate change. It aimed to keep alive the target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above temperature levels before the Industrial Revolution. At PwC, we see many of Ireland's largest companies making significant progress in committing to science-based targets, which in its own is a very important step towards the highest ambition levels. But there's more work to do, and PwC's 2021 Global CEO Survey highlighted a disconnect between the importance CEOs place on climate change and how much they're prepared to invest towards a sustainable environment. In our recent Net Zero Economy Index, the report found that the global rate of decarbonisation must increase by 5 times to meet the Paris Agreement climate goal. And so too has COP26 demonstrated there is so much more to do. While global executives broadly welcomed the Glasgow Climate Pact, many said it did not go far enough. Combined with increased ambition and action from countries, the deal means that the 1.5 degrees remains in sight, but it will only be delivered with concerted and immediate global effects. Importantly, all countries agreed to revisit and strengthen in 2022 their current emissions targets to 2030. Over the past few days since the weekend, we've heard commentators talk about the deal, saying things like nowhere near enough. Imperfect COP26 builds platform for hastening action. Negotiators argue to strengthen emissions targets by the end of 2022, watered down coal commitment. COP26 reaches consensus on key actions. So with all that backdrop, I'm pleased to introduce my expert panel this morning. And just before I introduce them, we'll have a discussion and it will be followed by a Q&A session. So feel free during the course of the next hour to add any questions in the chat box as they come to you, and I hope we'll be able to deal with them at the end of the session. So my first panel member is Katie Mills. She is Head of Sustainable Development and Innovation for the UK and Ireland at Schneider Electric. Next we have Cormac Nevin, who is Head of Engineering at Veolia Ireland. And then we have Maeve McLynn, who is Deputy Director at the Climate Unit in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I'll now start the discussion by asking my first question. And for the first question, I have the same question for each of the panel members, and I'll start with Maeve. Maeve, in your opinion, has COP26 been a success? And if not, why not?
Thanks very much, Mary, and thanks very much for the invitation as well to join this webinar. It's, I think, very timely given that the COP only finished last Saturday, so I think it's a perfect moment to reflect a little bit on what happened. I suppose just to react immediately to your question about success, and as someone who's been to several COPs, I'm always reluctant to ever, frame a COP in whether it's a success or not, and I think that's because it's so multifaceted and it's a milestone as part of a much broader effort on international climate action, and so it's always very difficult to say whether it's fully a success or whether it's a failure or not a success. I think a key element is the fact that it's multilateralism, and anyone who's familiar with trying to build consensus is that it takes time, it takes effort, and it also takes a level of give and take and compromise. And I think coming out on Saturday evening with the COP decision, there was definitely a lot of consensus building and a lot of compromise that were made. So from the perspective of multilateralism, I would probably say that it was to some degree successful, because it showed that countries are still bought into doing things together. They're still bought into doing climate action, but they need to, that there's more recognition of the different pace at which countries are doing it. So from that perspective, I think that's important. And I think the role of large economies there is really crucial. Unfortunately, though, from the science perspective and the climate science in particular, I think we're at a difficult point, and where you could say that we're falling slightly short of success, just because the reality is that we're at 1.1 degree warmer than pre-industrial levels. So that's in 2021, and our aim is to stay below 1.5. But we're still emitting large volumes of greenhouse gas emissions, which is increasing our global temperature. And so I think when it comes to science, the urgency is probably not met with the action needed. And I think that's, which we can discuss a little bit later, that has led to a lot of frustration and disappointment and upset about the outcome, because we talk about emergency, we talk about crisis, we talk about urgency, but when it came to the decision, it didn't really reflect that. But again, that goes back to, we're reflecting 197 countries trying to come to an agreement, and as we know, that's very tricky. So there that's my main immediate reaction to that question, and I'm really interested to hear Cormac and Katie's take on it as well.
Okay, thank you, Maeve. And I should have said it at the beginning, Maeve, we're really lucky to have Maeve. She spent 2 weeks at COP. She must be exhausted. So thank you again, Maeve, for your contribution this morning. And this is in the individual opinion. So I'm interested to hear from you, Cormac. Has COP26 been a success in your view? And if not, why not?
Hi, Marianne. Thanks again for the invite to this morning's webinar. Yeah, I suppose I have a small bit of a different perspective, obviously, from Maeve, but I would echo some of her comments as well. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to participate in such a way. I didn't attend, but was watching from the sidelines attentively. But I would definitely echo the consensus and the success in bringing together 197 nations in any kind of a common agreement. Ireland is one party to that, and I think it's very significant that we can get a common ground on such a wide variety, or a wide topic that is climate change. It touches everybody's lives in different ways, and we see that from the developing nations versus the developed nations also. The primary goal obviously was consensus and keeping this 1.5 degree target alive. I think that was a success, although it's pushed a lot of pressure onto COP27 in setting the targets. So I think it's sent every party away with a clear instruction that they have to come back to the table next year with some definitive actions and goals for each one of the participants. The direct reference to fossil fuel and coal obviously got a lot of media attention, and the reason for that media attention really is it's kind of unprecedented that there be such a direct reference to an industry in itself, and whether or not it was defined as being eliminated or let's say phased out or phased down. I think it's very much just, that's only a play on words. What it really is, it's a significant indicator and signal to industry participants, to countries, to funders, that this is a dying industry and there's significant risks in investing in assets or contracts of that nature in the future, because every country has now signed up to what we're saying is phasing out. But that only means that it's going down, and that's the significant, I suppose, commitment made by all the parties. One piece where I'm a small bit more negative and a bit disheartened was the loss and damages. I would feel that was a complete failure. the commitment for future dialogue wasn't really the target here. The target was to get commitment from the developed nations and the highest emitters to support the countries that are basically feeling the impact of climate change right now. And for them, it's a matter of life and death. It's not an investment decision. So in all, a bit of a mixed bag. I think it's generally positive, but there's still quite an amount to do. The loss and damages piece, I don't think, is going to be easily negotiated. There's the Santiago network. It's a step in the right direction, but it's very, very little.
Well, thank you, Cormac, and it's interesting to hear a different perspective. So I'm now going to ask Katie for her view on whether COP26 has been a success, and Katie, if not, why not?
Thank you, Mary, and again, thank you for having me. I agree with both Cormac and Maeve actually on point. So I probably sit a little bit in the middle of the two of them. Look, it could always go further. We could always be doing more. But ultimately, there were some successes and there were some wins. I actually think what it really showed us was the important role that businesses now play in driving forward initiatives around climate change. So we can't just rely on governments to look at legislation and policy. We have to take responsibility as large organizations to say, okay, this isn't good enough and we're going to do more and we're going to step up. And I really think that was highlighted this year more and more on that kind of real corporate responsibility around sustainability and climate change, which ultimately, is going to move a lot quicker than any government. Government with all the best of intentions is not a quick moving machine. So ultimately, you need the private sector to kind of get on board and really be driving it at a much quicker pace. And I think we can drive it at a much quicker pace moving forward. So that for me has been a kind of real positive to come out of things. But ultimately, we wouldn't be in the roles that we're in if we were not passionate about solving issues around climate change. And so for me, on a personal note, so sorry, just as the doorbell goes, which is great. On a personal note, I want us to be doing more. And I agree very much with Cormac on kind of loss and also around investment that needs to go further. And us as kind of as developed nations that have been some of the biggest contributors need to stand up, hold our hands up and say, we acknowledge that. And so we're going to do something different about it. So yeah, that's very much kind of my viewpoint on COP this year. And then again, like Cormac said, it's now on COP27, right? We've kind of passed the buck a little bit to say, well, we've done a little bit, we've ticked the boxes, guys. We've kind of moved the conversation forward and we've worked on collaboration, but good luck, COP27, it's now on you. So, it's going to be another case of wait and see what happens really for the next 12 months, I think.
Thank you, Katie. And politics does move slowly, and there's a lot of politics in this. So my next question, Maeve, as we said earlier, you were in Glasgow. Can you talk to us about the role the Department of Foreign Affairs played at COP26, and were you satisfied with the outcome of that role?
Yeah, I mean, I was there, a grueling 2 weeks, I would say, to be honest, and I think it's really a marathon for a lot of people when you participate for the whole time. So I was there as part of our DFA delegation, which is also part of our wider Irish delegation that's led by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. So it was, I think, possibly the largest representation that Ireland had at the COP, which was brilliant because it signified, that we're putting more into it as a country, but we're also represented by the European Union. So our work to a large degree is actually also in advance of COP. And I think this is the interesting thing when you're working within the negotiations. There's this big moment, which is actually 2 weeks, but a lot of the work is done months in advance, both in terms of pre-discussions, preparing positions, discussing positions with civil society and other parties. So I think that's an important one to note, and where where governments have been working on this for quite a while. It's not just at those 2 weeks, it's for months in advance. And so we worked quite closely with our colleagues in the Department for Environment on preparing Ireland's overall approach to COP. And I think that was reflected well in a lot of the pieces of work that we did. And I heard with interest that Cormac mentioned loss and damage, because my colleague Jen was very much involved in those negotiations. And if I thought I had a tough 2 weeks, she definitely had a tough 2 weeks. I mean, she was all-nighters trying to thrash out agreements essentially between the most vulnerable countries and developed countries, and it's no small feat. So there's that element of it where we were very much engaged on the negotiations as a team, and particularly for DFA, that's around adaptation to climate change, loss and damage, and climate financing, because as DFA and Irish Aid, a large volume of funding to climate goes from our development programs and through our bilateral programs in developing countries. So it's of importance to us to have an understanding what the concerns are of developing countries as well, in the context of the UN discussions. And so within the negotiations, we were basically tracking and working with EU counterparts, but also trying to act as a broker with developing countries, because Ireland has quite a close working and I suppose longer legacy with some vulnerable developing countries, and so that was a big piece of work. In addition to that, we had 2 ministers travel over in the second week, Minister Coveney and Minister of State Brophy, and they really drew a lot of attention to issues around adaptation, the issues and challenges facing small island developing states, many of which are really struggling at this point because of the impacts of climate change, and around issues on the sustainable blue economy, and linking those the areas around broader environmental protection and biodiversity with climate change, climate action, and adaptation. And so we really tried to kind of be proactive both through the negotiations, but also through the political level, in terms of raising issues that are of concern for Ireland, but also concern for countries that we work with. And again, you know, touching on what we did at COP, but also in advance of COP, we tried to raise a lot of attention to the issue of financing for adaptation, because there is a lot of flows of funding going to climate change, and a lot of large-scale projects that are happening, but there are still many vulnerable countries that can't access financing, and they actually need financing to just deal with the impacts of climate change. And Ireland has been working together with a number of countries through a champions group on adaptation finance to basically elevate this issue and to highlight again the responsibility of developed countries and financial actors, because this is not something where you're going to get a huge rate of return. You're essentially protecting livelihoods, you're protecting communities. So there's some of the things that we as DFA were doing. Within the broader scope, there was a lot of leadership demonstrated by our colleagues in the Department for Environment, and the Minister for Environment was there as head of delegation in the second week. And I have to say, I think collectively we played a very, very strong and active role throughout the 2 weeks, which I was happy with, even if the outcome of the COP wasn't as satisfactory as we would have liked.
So thank you, Maeve. While you're still continuing, or while you're there, I have another question for you. Can you provide an overview of the reaction to the COP agreement of developing countries, particularly those that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Irish Aid work with?
Yeah, thanks. And I think actually, and again, I'd reference what Cormac mentioned as well earlier about, you know, the vulnerability of countries, and particularly the big issue, I think, for many countries that we work with was loss and damage. And this is really like, it's a term that we use without, you know, maybe explaining it. It is essentially anything that, you know, any losses related to climate impacts, and that can include your loss of culture, identity, livelihood, loss of life. Very hard to sometimes measure. And I think that was something that was a priority for developing countries, and particularly the most vulnerable ones, so the least developed countries and those islands that face essentially non-existence as a result of climate change. So that was a big one. And again, I think we've discussed that the outcome on that to some degree was really, I think, quite disappointing for many of those countries. Very disappointing, I would say. I think anyone who would have heard the minister, for example, of Maldives speak about it as a small island, really, really challenging circumstances, because they're living with climate impacts as we speak. So I think that was definitely a priority for them, and where I think there's a lot left to work on, essentially. I would say the other piece is around climate financing, which I've mentioned already, and particularly support for adaptation financing. And I think for developing countries and the countries we work with, again, they're living with impacts. So it's really a sense of is the funding and the support getting to where it needs to go for those countries to become more resilient to climate change, because this is their reality now. And I think, again, like there was a target made and established in 2009 to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020 for developing countries to address climate change, and that target wasn't met. So that was a bit of that hung over a little bit the conversations on climate finance throughout the COP, because it was a bit of it demonstrated a slight like failure in meeting commitments and promises, which then erodes trust between developing countries and developed countries. So I think that really influenced the conversations within the rooms, and so it's actually trying to rebuild that, and coming out, there's some reaffirmed commitments on climate finance, but there needs to be assurances that they'll be met. And so I think those two areas, I think, stood out to me as key priorities for the countries that Irish Aid and that DFA work closely with.
Thank you, Maeve. That's really interesting. I'm now going to turn to Cormac and ask Cormac, can he summarise the role Ireland played at the recent COP?
I probably can't add too much more detail than Maeve has already informed us. But I suppose, as from a spectator's perspective, Ireland obviously was part of the negotiation team, which is a very, I suppose, prominent negotiator in the COP, or in COP26 this year. The attendance of a couple of, I suppose, significant heads in the form of Micheál Martin and Eamon Ryan obviously were standout participants, and some of their commentary and their and some of their speeches were particularly poignant. I suppose the most notable contributions, I suppose, are probably through the signatories and the commitments that were made throughout the 2 weeks. We look at the high ambition goal, which I don't think Ireland will always be noted to have very high ambitions. The Beyond Coal and Gas Alliance, which is very closely aligned with our own Climate Act 2021 that was put into legislation this year. The commitment to zero emission cars, green aviation and green shipping, or greening aviation and green shipping lanes, and obviously the final Glasgow Climate Pact. Going back to a point there that Maeve mentioned around the support for climate finance and the $100 billion target. Ireland has announced a 225 million contribution per year by 2025, which I think is very, very important to be highlighted. And I don't think it kind of captured too much notoriety in media. But the OECD has projected the climate financing total for 2023. I think is going to clear the $100 billion mark, which I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to say the climate financing element was disappointing even in COP26. I think there's a clear roadmap there to clearing that target. Also, Ireland have committed to a €10 million climate adaptation fund contribution for the end of 2022, and the €5 million contribution to the Santiago network, which is particularly concentrated on the loss and damages and the developing countries' concerns. There was two very interesting events that Ireland actually hosted, and which were the Delivering Cleaner Energy Future, and that was hosted in conjunction with EirGrid, the transmission system operator here in Ireland, and the Dialogue Towards European Peatlands Initiative. And those are two very, I suppose, important factors, or two important pieces of the energy industry here in Ireland, and I suppose our overall carbon emissions. And it's taken centre stage, specifically in the Midlands, around our transitioning away from peat consumption or peat burning in an attempt to reduce our carbon emissions in the electricity mix. So I suppose the transport endorsements as well included in COP26 are specifically, I suppose, aligned with our own ambitions, which I thought were very well detailed and clear as well.
Thank you, Cormac. I had difficulty unmuting myself. So Katie, a different question for you. How can business create realistic climate targets?
Realistic is an interesting one, right? So we all need to be ambitious about our targets ultimately, but I think it's about having interim targets then that you can set on the road to your much bigger ambition. So at Schneider, we have a 2030 net zero target, scope 1 and 2. And as part of that kind of 2030 initiative, we have very specific interim targets that we are hitting kind of every 3 years. And every 3 years, we kind of reassess those targets and reassess what our strategy is around those targets moving forward to make sure that we are constantly on track to hit those 2030 targets. So I think there has to be a kind of a nice middle ground of true ambition versus what is actually possible. And actually having those kind of interim steps and interim targets makes it much more manageable, I think, for large organizations to be able to break down then what those targets need to be. And that's really kind of the only way forward. And then really, I think when you look at hitting those targets, it has to be about collaboration too. So one of the approaches that we are kind of taking more and more is to say, we know we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. So we need to be open to working with people that do have answers that we don't, and taking a much more kind of ecosystem collaborative approach to dealing with some of our big challenges around whether that's carbon reduction, whether that's biodiversity, and working with kind of new technologies and new innovations that are really kind of coming through to make sure that we can hit those targets, and if anything, go further. We kind of talk about the kind of AAA approach in Schneider. So we talk about analytics, so making sure that you're measuring. Obviously, you can't improve what you're not measuring, so analytics is key, ambition, and then action. And those are the three kind of AAA approach that we take with anything to do with our climate change targets.
Sorry, thank you for that, Katie. So Cormac, another question for you. Where do you think Ireland fits on the international stage in terms of progress towards achieving carbon neutrality?
I mentioned this just earlier on, and I suppose Ireland will never be short of ambition. and we have very high ambitions, and they're signalled through our Carbon Action Plan in 2021. The 80% renewable electricity target, very much a stretch target. It's been borne out through some of our, I suppose, grid capacity issues that we've seen in the last couple of months. I don't want to get into a too technical discussion, but it is very much a front and center of a lot of people on renewable electricity penetration in the network. 1 million EVs by 2030, 1,500 electric buses will contribute towards our transport targets. There's specific agribusiness incentives to support generation of renewables and biodiversity and emissions reduction, and the development of the sectoral budgets within the Climate Action Plan will also drive a signal to all public and private sector participants to control and reduce their emissions. The latest targets, or the latest legislation has legally bound Ireland to a 51% emissions reduction and a carbon neutral roadmap for 2050. And so I think in all, from an international stage, we're not short of ambition, but it's all going to be in the actions over the next couple of years.
So a lot of money is required, and pain for us as individuals, and people needing to change, which is always difficult. Next question is for Katie. Katie, where do you think the responsibility and accountability lie in reaching net zero?
It's everyone's responsibility. I know that's a real kind of cliche, cheesy line to say, but it really is. It's not any one entity's responsibility. It's like how we look at sustainability strategies within business, is that it's every employee's responsibility to drive us towards those goals and those targets. And you know, every entity has a role to play, whether that's government, whether that's business. They absolutely have their individual roles, but everyone has to work together and pull together within the same kind of with the same goals in the same direction in order for us to get there in the time limit that we have. So I think it's not really a case of whose responsibility. It's a case of us. It's a case of us all taking responsibility and really driving it forward.
Thank you. I think I agree with you there. Coming back to you, Maeve, can you talk to us about the kinds of concerns that were raised from civil society and youth activists during the COP? And do you think their criticism of the COP outcome was valid?
Yeah, I suppose I think it's important to reference this also, just because in Glasgow there were thousands of people marching in probably what was the worst day of rain they had for weeks. So I think the commitment to getting out in the street and demonstrating was really noted, and I think really important to see. So I think that some of the criticisms that we heard from civil society groups fell around the inclusivity and transparency and lack thereof, actually, for civil society groups being able to access the rooms, being able to even get into the venue at times. And this actually stems even from before the COP starts. It's in the distribution of badges to even attend the COP. So that came to our attention quite early on at the beginning of the conference, and I think efforts were made, and I think countries actually can weigh in and highlight this and ensure that access is provided for, and that discussions are more inclusive, and that there is space to observe, because civil society play an important role in observing the negotiations and calling out kind of and representing the views of people and of communities that can't travel to these conferences. So I think that was a major one. And then more broadly, I think for for me and from the conversations we had, there was a lot of the resonance around climate justice and what that means, and it goes back to a lot of what we've already discussed. It's limiting
I think we've lost Maeve.
So I have a new question.
Yeah.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you okay, Mary.
Okay, so I've a new, thank you for Maeve for that. Sorry, I missed the end of it. New question for Cormac. Cormac, is Ireland seen as a leader or as lagging behind as regards climate action by its peers in the EU and the wider international community?
I think that's a difficult enough question to answer. Obviously, I'm coming from the from the inside, so I see, let's say, Ireland's renewable or climate action from a business perspective, and what businesses are actually committing to and achieving to late. But if you look at it from a higher viewpoint or a higher level, Eurostat publications would have us at probably, I think it's the third highest emitter per head of population, which isn't really a good place to be. That stat could probably be watered down if you overlay it with GDP, but I think in essence it's not where we wanted to be. On a positive note, we can only get better. On a positive perspective, I think it's very important to highlight the developments and progress we've made, specifically in renewable electricity targets and achievements. So as of 2020, the electricity from renewable sources on our grid is at about 43%. I think the target there is it's been increased up to 80% by 2030 in the last the last publication by the department. And currently EirGrid, the TSO, can facilitate about 75% of SNSP, which is system non-synchronous penetration, which in layman terms it's wind and solar generation. So that's significant, and the only thing I suppose waiting for that kind of development or that kind of resource to be put onto the grid is investment and construction. To date, we've probably been missing a real signal from the government on renewable heat incentives. We don't really have a functioning support scheme for the likes of biogas, biomethane, or even biomass at a let's say at a commercial or industrial scale. That has been moved on in recent times with the development of the support scheme or the renewable heat obligation scheme, and that consultation was completed last year, and it looks like we'll hopefully have something next year. And that should give investors some comfort in taking the plunge in investing in those types of supply chains, be it from agri fuel sources right through to biomass production here in Ireland.
Thanks, Cormac. That was a really interesting to what you described in the beginning as a hard question. I have another question for Katie. We know that there's a lot of change from this morning and from just general knowledge and from all of the media comments in the last couple of weeks. And it's very clear to me, at least in some cases, livelihoods are at stake. So question for you, Katie, what do you think is required to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles in Ireland?
Investment in the grid is one of your biggest kind of challenges in Ireland, and that needs to be a kind of real top priority. But then also looking at alternatives to your kind of current grid setup. So whether that's microgrids, looking at that in the future of how that can support EV infrastructure, is kind of really the way forward. We've actually just started our EV fleet rollout across Schneider, so in the UK and Ireland, and we have around about 1,500 cars that we are switching to EV. And it's interesting to see the challenges that have come out of that, not just from a kind of infrastructure perspective, but also from a behavioural change perspective. So there is definitely a kind of role to be played as well around how you influence behaviour change, how you help people become accustomed to new behaviours. We've had the discussions with our own people where they've said, but I've now got to stop and it's going to take me 4 hours rather than 3 to get where I need to go. And we said, well, really sorry guys, but our current behaviours are not sustainable. That's why we're having to change, right? So there is a case of people not of kind of getting people comfortable with new ways of doing things, and taking people with you on that journey, I think, is a really important part. But ultimately, I have an electric car. I live in central London. I don't have a driveway, but I have a charge point down the road from me, so I can do that. But when I went on a journey the other day, wherever I stopped, there was at least 3 or 4 broken charge points. So we definitely need to improve all of the infrastructure around electric vehicle charging, whether that's at home, whether that's when you're away. And that's the same across, the whole of the UK and Ireland. Really, we have aging infrastructure and aging grids that really need to be supported for us to really see quicker adoption of EV. And then finally really is around the cost of EV. So right now it costs you more to have an electric car than a non-electric car. And when we talk about incentivizing people to be more sustainable, we have to look at how we can incentivize more and more people to go electric. And I think car manufacturers have a real responsibility to play in looking at cheaper models that are coming out, and they are coming through, right? They are starting to come through, and we'll see more and more kind of cheaper EV models coming through. But we have to incentivize people to want to drive an electric car, because there is something in it for them other than just doing good for the environment. And I think that's another key part, is how we do that moving forward.
Thank you, Katie. Just to remind the audience, we have a maximum of 15 minutes left. I have more questions for the panel, but I'm very happy as well to open it to questions from the audience. So if anyone would like to ask a question, could you type it into the chat? And if it's aimed at a particular person, would you mind saying who you would like to direct your question to? Thank you. So just to continue then, Maeve, I have another question for you. Coming out of COP26, what are the next steps for all the participants, which I've called actors, including governments, the private sector, communities, businesses, on this climate action that we've been discussing?
Thanks, and I think that it was touched on earlier at the beginning of the call, and I think particularly Cormac touched on it, around the need for the signal on fossil fuels is getting clearer and clearer. As the first, I suppose, a decision text coming from a UN climate conference that explicitly references fossil fuels is really, really important. That for me is important, because then you take that down to the national level, and really what we want to see is maybe public sector and actors taking the leadership and setting the targets in the right way. And then that has a knock-on effect for private sector, for businesses, for communities, for subnational, like we would see for, you've got a top-line approach from UN to EU to Ireland's Climate Act and our Climate Action Plan, that then needs to also kind of go down to other levels. And I think that Katie mentioned many things around businesses and private sector taking really important steps around their own decarbonisation plans and pursuing more sustainable pathways for how business is conducted. And I think that that's really crucial. And it's doing that within this broader framework and having the correct regulation to ensure that it's done in a way that is, compatible with other areas of work as well, and that it's actually fulfilling obligations and responsibilities. But it's definitely, I think we're going in the right direction. And I think something that I didn't mention is some of the announcements that were made by some of the largest financial actors in the world, and led by Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and how he has driven this kind of approach of the financial sector getting behind work to basically move finance out of fossil fuels. And I think that is a real crucial one, because if you take the money away, you're giving that clear signal that this is a stranded asset. It's an investment that won't have any return. And actors like that are really crucial. And I think getting more involvement from businesses, from financial institutions is crucial. And I think this COP puts us in that direction. We need to be kept on that direction. And I think that's why I'm always more comfortable calling COPs and conferences milestones, because it's just about keeping us on track and going in the right way. We need to do it faster is the key thing, I think, in this circumstance. But from that perspective, I think if most countries start distilling down where more action can be done, I think we might hopefully see a bit more progress on climate ambition at COP27 next year.
I see we have a question for the panel. Can my fellow panelists see the question? Oh, okay. Not the question is not there yet. So while we're waiting for the question, Katie, a question for you. Climate action will also bring opportunities. Do you have views on opportunities for business and for Ireland?
Absolutely. I think there are huge opportunities for business with everything to do with sustainability and climate change. There are opportunities around technologies and around innovating with new technologies. There are opportunities around business models. So actually one of the most exciting innovations that we are going to see more and more of is business model innovation over the next few years, as ESG finance becomes more and more available, as we see the kind of divergence of investment in fossil fuels into green economies and into net zero technologies. So for us, that's where we think there is huge opportunity for every organisation to look at how they do things in a far more sustainable way with a completely new business model. The residential sector is a perfect example of that, and a real opportunity in the likes of Ireland too is we have to decarbonise housing. It's a massive challenge to decarbonise ageing housing stocks, but there is funding available to do that, and we need to be able to look at new business models in kind of how we tackle some of the biggest challenges when it comes to climate change. But with every challenge comes opportunity, so there are huge opportunities here for everyone to shift their focus and make sure really that ultimately corporates and businesses exist to serve the communities in which they operate. And there is no better way to serve your community than making sure that you are doing good within that community, rather than doing anything negative. So I think that's the kind of viewpoint and the approach to take, is every challenge brings an opportunity with it.
Thank you, Katie. I have a few questions here now. I'm not going to have time, I think, to ask each panelist for their view on all of the questions. So I'm going to start with the first question. I think for Maeve, I'll ask you the first question. What do you think will be the most important next step for government, business and society to take in Ireland to ensure that we are on the best footing possible going into COP27?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the most important thing is we've set out, the government in the last 12 months has established a climate act and has just published a climate action plan. that's housing a lot of the work that needs to be done. And I think it's engaging with that act. And actually, you know, I was having conversations with people last week about how communities can get involved in better implementing the objectives of that act, how young people can get involved, how local authorities. I think there are opportunities, and it's presenting yourselves or ourselves to the government and to the leading department, I think, as well on this, around the intention to be part of that work. And I think that's really important. If there's dialogues, if there's funding available, all of that kind of opportunity within the framework of the Climate Action Plan and the National Climate Bill are I think, within Ireland, a key opportunity.
Just to add to Maeve's point, if that's okay, Mary, I think as well, accountability is key here, right? We all have a responsibility to hold everyone accountable to what they say they're going to do over the next 12 months. And I think, you know, society has a responsibility to hold governments accountable. Ultimately, that's why they're there to serve us, and we have a responsibility to hold them accountable, and also to kind of hold each other accountable. You know, I had the question with my local authority the other day is, what is our recycling policy, please? Can you tell me where it all goes? And it took them 3 days to get back to me because no one actually knew. So, you know, we all have a role to play in holding people, well, in holding entities and kind of people accountable to what they say they're going to do.
Thank you. So there was a question on the dairy industry. Now that's a very difficult question, I think. Cormac, do you have views on whether we can meet our targets without significant changes to our dairy industry?
I think in short, the answer is probably no, which isn't a very popular answer. When we look at agriculture in general, the sectoral targets or sectoral budgets for carbon emissions detailed in the Climate Action Plan. I think agriculture in general is set for a reduction in emissions by 30%. That's not going to be achieved without having a bottom-up approach to emissions in the full supply chain of the dairy food market. I have the advantage of dealing with the dairy industry from a manufacturing perspective, and there's a huge amount of development and ambition in that sector to decarbonize and reach a carbon neutral position. But from I suppose a farm level through to consumer, the farm level is definitely where the biggest challenges are. There's a huge amount of work to be completed and a huge amount of support needed to facilitate the likes of biodiversity transition from heavy nitrogen fertilizers and I suppose putting some alternatives from a revenue perspective in the roadmap for the farming community as well is very important. A lot of that is spelled out in the climate plan, but there's a lot of detail needed, and there's been a lot of dialogue and discussion about it of recent. But action is imminent. I don't think we have much more time to stand by.
Very much. We have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to comment quickly on how do we bring people along with this. We need to change everything rather than only some things, but for the changes to come first, how do we make those impact most, not feel that they're taking impacted most, not feeling they're taking the full brunt. So can I start with Katie? Do you have a quick view on that, and then I'll go to Maeve and then to Cormac?
That's a big question for a quick view, I would say.
It is, yeah. 4 minutes left.
How do we take people with us? I think we are already seeing people going on that journey more and more, right? You can see that with kind of public consensus that more and more people are understanding the importance of this and why we all need to go on this journey together. I think incentivization is always a great way of doing things for people. And then actually looking at kind of more circular models around that. So how do we incentivize people to be greener? And then how do you take that kind of incentivization and do better with it? Ultimately taxes as well, I hate to say it, but it's the way that we can start to produce more and more funding that can then really go back to the people that need it. And ultimately, you know, we should be taxed on the negativity that we bring into the planet, and we can then give that back to those that are kind of really feeling the brunt of it. So not a very popular term, but definitely a kind of key one moving forward.
Thank you, Katie. Maeve, quick views on this question?
Yeah, and I think it's always a challenging one, because you see thousands of people mobilized on the street, and so you think, well, surely they are, you know, there's people there that want to see more. So I think that I agree with Katie. There is a lot of there's a lot already happening, and there's a lot of people who are already kind of on this pathway and understand it. I think for me, one of the key things, and kind of looking at it from the perspective of what public actors need to do is really make sure that there's an empowerment and an information communication with people and involvement. I think that came up a lot, as I recall, with talking about the Ireland's climate bill, is like give people the tools, let them also be part of this, because it can't just always be imposed. But then from the understanding perspective, I think finding the right messengers, finding people we trust to talk about these issues is really important too, because we need to have reliable information on what's happening and what people can do, and that has to come from peer groups that are listened to by wider groups of people. So there's a number of key things, but I do think communication is important, and touching on Katie's point, ensuring that there's funding and support so that there's no isolation of people, particularly economically, because that will of course have ramifications. So it's not easy, but definitely I think things are already happening. So it's just building on that to some degree.
Final comments from you, Cormac?
I think I'd have to echo both Katie and Maeve's points. The ownership of an individual's carbon emission or carbon footprint, and communication, so that people actually understand what that actually means in the wider frame. From a business and an industrial perspective, and the viewpoint of the large energy consumer, the energy markets is actually one of the biggest incentives at the moment, and you see what we're going through at on the international energy trading platforms, where you see natural gas going up in some cases nearly 10 times what it would have been 2 to 3 years ago for the same period of time. So that incentive is there, and the mechanism that individuals and businesses have to hedge against that volatility is investment in their own energy efficiency, on-site renewable generation. And if you look at energy efficiency, it's the lowest cost energy that you'll ever spend. If for every euro you spend, you'll get more value out of that than you will in any investment. Investment in energy per se. The fact that solar and wind are now cheaper to actually construct than most other fossil fuels, and I think Katie mentioned it earlier on, that corporates have an ambition to reduce their carbon emissions and to achieve carbon neutral goals, and they are coming in at a far faster pace than the national ambitions, and that's very important that we have large corporates leading by example. I suppose from my perspective, it's the ownership piece and taking ownership of what you are actually emitting, and that's from scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and having accountability of that. So measuring it and putting a plan in place is very important for the individual right through to the major corporate.
Thank you, Cormac. We have just reached the end of the time that we have allotted for this. I suppose I could sum it up by, there's a lot of pressure on COP27. That's my tagline from this morning's discussion. So finally, just to thank Katie, Maeve and Cormac for their invaluable insights. And I would like to thank the audience as well for your participation. I wish everybody a great day. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks all.